the heart of this nation, under skies so blue,
there's a spirit that's stirring, values strong and true.
From the mountains to the prairies, from the cities to the sea, we stand for liberty, for faith and family. We're diving deep into the heart of what we believe.
So get ready, because we're diving into a pretty intense diplomatic situation today.
Oh, yeah, this one's a doozy.
It is. And, we're talking about the South African Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool getting kicked out of the U.S. by our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio.
Yeah, and you can't forget the big name in all of this.
Exactly.
Yes.
Former President Trump, who, as everyone knows, is, back in the Oval Office now.
Right, back in the thick of it.
So you might think at first glance that this is just another, political squabble. But I think there's a lot more to it.
Oh, absolutely. This has the potential to be a really big deal globally.
Exactly. So that's why we're here today, to do a deep dive into this and really unpack what's going on and what it all means.
Yeah, I think what's so interesting about this is how it really highlights the tension between the U.S. and South Africa.
Right. It's not just about what one person said.
No, it's so much bigger than that.
Yeah. So to kind of set the stage, Rubio went on X.
It used to be Twitter.
Right, exactly. And basically declared Rasool persona non grata.
Which is a pretty huge deal.
It is. And he even accused Rasool of hating America and hating Trump.
Yeah, strong words.
So my question is this just like political theater? Or is this declaration really as serious as it sounds?
So persona non grata is not something that you see very often in the world of diplomacy. It basically signals that things have completely broken down.
Wow.
There's no more communication. It's like slamming the door shut on any further discussion. And to really understand how significant this is, you have to look at some historical examples.
Oh, okay. So what are we talking about?
Well, one that comes to mind is back in 1964, when France expelled the Soviet ambassador after a big spy scandal. And it took years for those two countries to even start talking again.
Wow. So this is not something that countries do lightly.
No, not at all.
So that kind of begs the question, what exactly did Rasool say that triggered this whole thing? I know he gave a speech at a think tank in Johannesburg. Mm-hmm. And I think he made some pretty strong accusations against Trump.
Yeah, so basically he claimed that Trump is leading this global supremacist movement and tied that to the whole Magier movement here in the U.S.
Right, which is obviously a very politically charged term.
Absolutely. And Rasool also pointed to demographic shifts in the U.S. That whole idea that white voters are projected to become a minority as kind of a driving force behind this supposed movement.
So he's basically saying that there's this fear of losing power and privilege.
Right. And he even called out people like J.D. Vance and Elon Musk.
Oh, wow. And isn't Musk originally from South Africa?
He is, which makes it even more interesting.
It does. And what did he say about them?
He accused them of promoting this idea of white victimhood.
Okay, so that term white victimhood, what does that even mean in this context?
So it's this idea that white people are being unfairly targeted or marginalized, that they're losing their power and privilege, and that's not necessarily true.
Right.
And Rasool's argument is that this feeling of victimhood is being exploited to, push certain political agendas.
Yeah, to justify certain policies.
Exactly. And you can actually trace this kind of rhetoric back to the backlash against the civil rights movement, or even further back to, justifications for colonialism and slavery.
Wow. So it's got a long and complicated history.
It does.
It makes you think about how past injustices can really shape the political narratives we see today.
For sure.
So Rasool made these claims about Trump and a supremacist movement.
Yeah.
But is there any evidence to back that up?
That's where things get a little murky.
Okay.
There's no doubt that Trump's rhetoric and policies have appealed to some with white nationalist views.
Right.
But to say that he's leading a global movement, that might be a bit of a stretch.
Yeah.
I think you have to look at Rasool's statements within the larger context.
So what's going on in South Africa?
Exactly. Their own foreign policy goals, their complex history with race and power.
Because they definitely have a unique perspective on these issues.
Absolutely. They lived through decades of apartheid, which was this system of racial segregation and oppression that only ended in the early 1990s.
Right, relatively recently.
And that experience has definitely shaped their view of the world. They might see echoes of their own struggles and what's happening in the U.S. and globally.
And to make things even more complicated, we can't forget about Trump's executive order from February, where he cut off aid to South Africa.
Oh, right. He cited their aggressive positions towards the U.S. and its allies, but it seems like there's more to it than that.
There's always more to this story.
Always.
So what else was going on?
Well, the order specifically mentioned South Africa's accusations of Israeli genocide at the International Court of Justice.
Oh, wow.
Which definitely ruffled some feathers with U.S. allies. And then there's the fact that they're strengthening ties with Iran, which the U.S. has had a tense relationship with for decades.
Right. So this aid cutoff isn't just about one ambassador's comment.
No, it's about a clash of geopolitical interests.
And here's where it gets really controversial.
Oh, yeah.
Trump's order also talks about resettling Afrikaner refugees from South Africa, claiming they're facing government-sponsored discrimination and land seizures.
Okay, so this is where we need to be careful.
Right.
Because the term Afrikaner refugees is incredibly loaded.
Yeah, it's very sensitive.
It taps into this whole debate about the treatment of white farmers in South Africa after apartheid.
Okay.
I mean, there are legitimate concerns about crime and violence affecting farmers, but some groups have exaggerated the situation, pushing this narrative of white genocide that's not really supported by evidence.
So there's a lot of misinformation swirling around out there.
Oh, absolutely. It's hard to know what to believe sometimes.
Right. So we've got this diplomatic expulsion, accusations of supremacy and white victimhood, and aid cutoff, and this whole controversy over Afrikaner refugees. It's a lot to unpack.
It's a tangled web for sure.
It is. So I guess what I'm wondering is, how does this all impact the average person? Like, what are the real world consequences of this breakdown in diplomacy?
Well, the most immediate consequence is that communication between the U.S. and South Africa is basically frozen, which makes it much harder to cooperate on important issues like trade, security, global health things that directly affect people's lives.
Right.
And then there are the longer term consequences, like the potential for this to further damage relations.
Yeah.
So distrust and even lead to a shift in alliances on the African continent.
So this could have ripple effects far beyond just the U.S. and South Africa.
Absolutely.
It makes you wonder if this is a sign of things to come. Like, is diplomacy becoming less effective in a world that seems increasingly polarized?
That's the big question, isn't it? Is diplomacy dead? Or can we find ways to bridge these divides to have these tough conversations and find common ground even when we disagree so strongly?
Right, because it feels like everyone's just digging in their heels these days.
It does. And to answer that question, I think we need to look beyond the headlines and really understand the motivations and strategies at play on both sides.
Right, so let's do that. Let's dig a little deeper into what's driving the U.S. and South Africa. Like, what are their goals, their fears, and how are they using their power on the world stage?
Okay, well, one thing that often gets overlooked in these situations is the role of soft power.
Soft power.
Yeah. It's not about military might or economic sanctions. It's about influence, persuasion, shaping the narrative.
Now, that's interesting. Yeah. So how are the U.S. and South Africa using soft power in this conflict?
Well, the U.S. under Trump's leadership is projecting an image of strength and assertiveness. They're using their economic and military power to push their agenda, even if it means alienating some allies.
Right.
And they're also trying to control the narrative, using terms like Afrikaner refugees to frame the situation in a way that supports their actions.
Okay, I see.
South Africa, on the other hand, is trying to leverage their moral authority as a nation that overcame apartheid.
Right.
They're appealing to global audiences, highlighting the dangers of racial prejudice and calling out what they see as hypocrisy in U.S. foreign policy.
So it's like a battle for hearts and minds.
Exactly, not just a political disagreement.
But how effective are these soft power strategies?
Well, that's what we'll explore next. We'll take a closer look at how the U.S. and South Africa are trying to win over public opinion, both domestically and internationally, and we'll examine the potential consequences of their actions.
Sounds like we've got a lot more to discuss.
Oh, yeah. This is just the tip of the iceberg.
Buckle up, everyone.
It's going to be a bumpy ride.
Stay tuned.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
So, one way they're doing this is by really building those alliances with other African nations.
Okay, interesting. So, how are they doing that?
Well, they're focusing on the issues they all have in common.
Makes sense.
Like economic development, security, and, that concern about Western countries meddling in Africa's business.
Yeah, basically saying, hey, we're all in this together.
Exactly. And they're not just stopping there. They're also reaching out to countries in the global south.
The global south. So who are we talking about here?
Countries in Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, places that often share a history of colonialism and are kind of wary of U.S. foreign policy.
Right. They're like, we've been there.
Exactly.
So it's like South Africa is trying to build this coalition of countries who all feel like they've been treated unfairly by the bigger powers.
That's a good way to put it.
Like they're banding together to say, hey, we deserve a seat at the table.
Exactly. And that message resonates with a lot of people globally,
I can see why.
especially those who feel marginalized or taken advantage of by the West.
Right.
It's like they're creating this counter narrative to the US's version of events.
Okay, so like how... So
Well, they're painting themselves as the champion for the underdog, the voice for those who don't have one.
Right.
And that's powerful.
It is. But let's flip the script for a second and look at it from the U.S. perspective.
Yeah.
They're not just going to sit back and let South Africa control the narrative.
Oh, no, they're definitely not.
So how are they pushing back against this soft power offensive?
Well, one way they're doing it is by trying to downplay the whole thing.
Okay, interesting. So how are they doing that?
Well, they're basically saying that Rasool's expulsion was just an isolated incident, a necessary response to his, over-the-top remarks.
Right, like they had to do it.
Yeah, and they're emphasizing their commitment to working with South Africa.
Right, trying to smooth things over.
Exactly. Saying we're still friends, we still want to cooperate.
Okay, but actions speak louder than words.
True. So they're also trying to highlight all the good things they're doing in Africa.
Like what kind of things?
Their development aid programs, their partnerships with African countries on things like counterterrorism and healthcare.
So they're like, hey, look at all the good we're doing.
Yeah, they're trying to show that they're still a reliable partner.
Right, and maybe prevent those countries from turning to other big players like China or Russia.
Exactly. Because the U.S. knows that Africa is a strategically important region, both economically and politically.
Right, they don't want to lose their influence there.
No, they don't. And they're also worried about instability and conflict in Africa.
Which could have consequences for the U.S. as well.
For sure. So it's like they're walking a tightrope.
You got to be careful.
Yeah, trying to project strength, but also reassure their allies that everything's cool.
Right. It's a tough balancing act.
It is.
So what about the folks back home here in the U.S.? How are they reacting to all of this?
Well, we talked about those social media reactions to Rubio's announcement.
Yeah, those are pretty intense.
They were, and it seems like a lot of people are on board with what he did.
Like they support his decision to expel Rasool.
Yeah, a lot of people are applauding him for taking a strong stance against what they see as anti-American rhetoric.
Right.
And I think that's partly because of how politically polarized things are in the U.S. right now.
Yeah, people are already kind of primed to see South Africa and other countries critical of the U.S. As you know, the enemy.
Yeah, it's us versus them.
And that makes it really hard to have a nuanced conversation.
It does, because everyone's just digging in their heels.
So is there any hope for like actual understanding in this kind of environment?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
It's easy to get swept up in all the outrage and the finger pointing.
It really is.
But I think we have to remember that there are real people on both sides of this.
Right.
People with their own concerns and perspectives.
Yeah, and they're all valid in their own way.
Exactly. The challenge is to cut through all the noise.
All the yelling.
Yeah. And create space for genuine dialogue.
Where people can actually listen to each other.
And try to understand where the other person's coming from, even if they don't agree.
Right. That's so important.
It is.
So that makes me think about the role of the media in all of this. Are they helping or hurting?
I mean, the media plays a huge role in shaping public perception.
They really do.
They have a responsibility to report on these events accurately and fairly.
To give the whole picture.
Exactly, and to avoid just sensationalizing things.
Right, because that just makes things worse.
It does, and they also have a role to play in fostering constructive dialogue.
So, like, how can they do that?
Well, they can feature diverse voices and perspectives.
Right, not just the same old talking heads.
Exactly. Unfortunately, though, we often see media outlets catering to specific audiences.
Right. Preaching to the choir.
Yeah, and that just reinforces existing biases.
And creates those echo chambers where everyone's just agreeing with each other.
And that makes it even harder to have productive conversations across political lines.
So it's not just on governments and diplomats to figure this out.
No, it's on all of us.
Journalists, commentators, even regular people.
We all have a responsibility to be more mindful of how we engage with these issues.
To think before we speak.
Yeah, to be critical consumers of information, to seek out different perspectives.
And to be willing to challenge our own assumptions.
Exactly.
That's a good point. It's not just about listening to people we agree with.
No, it's about being open to hearing different viewpoints, even if they make us uncomfortable.
Right, because that's how we grow and learn.
And it's also about being respectful.
Even when we disagree.
Yeah, because even if you disagree with someone's views, you're still interacting with another human being.
Right. It's about disagreeing without being disagreeable.
Exactly. And sometimes, even if you don't change someone's mind, you might plant a seed of doubt.
Make them think a little bit.
Yeah, or at least help them see that there are other ways of looking at things.
So it's not about winning the argument.
No, it's about extending the conversation.
And sometimes the most productive conversations are the ones that happen outside of the public eye.
Oh, yeah, away from all the noise and pressure.
Right, like those quiet one-on-one interactions.
Where you can really connect with someone on a human level.
Like over coffee or at a family dinner.
Exactly. Those are the places where you can build relationships and start to understand each other's perspectives in a deeper way.
It's about finding common ground.
Yeah, and those conversations, even if they seem small and insignificant, they can have a ripple effect.
That's a great point.
They can help break down those walls of distrust.
And create a more open and understanding society. This deep dive into the South African ambassador controversy has been quite a journey. We started with what seemed like a simple diplomatic incident, but we ended up exploring all these big questions.
Yeah, about power perception, the future of diplomacy.
In a world that's more interconnected and polarized than ever.
And it's become clear that these issues aren't just abstract political concepts.
No, they have real consequences for people's lives.
They affect economies, shape international relations, and influence how we see each other across borders and cultures.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What can they do to make sense of all this and maybe even make a positive impact?
Well, I think it comes back to those key ideas we've been talking about.
Okay, so like what?
Be curious, seek out different perspectives, listen with empathy, engage in respectful dialogue, and don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions.
And remember that even small actions can make a big difference.
Exactly.
The way we talk to each other online, the conversations we have with our friends and family, how we consume and share information, it all matters.
It really does. We have the power to shape the narrative, to build bridges of understanding and create a more just and equitable world.
That's a powerful thought.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a challenge.
Okay, I like it.
Go out there and have those tough conversations. Engage with people who think differently than you.
Don't be afraid to get uncomfortable.
Right. Listen, learn, challenge your own perspectives.
And you never know. You might be surprised by what you discover.
Yeah, it's a lot easier said than done, though, right?
It is. It takes work, especially when it's so easy to just stay in our own little bubbles, you know?
Right. Surrounded by people who already agree with us.
Exactly. But that's why it's even more important to get out of our comfort zones and really try to understand different points of view.
But how do you even start? It feels like everyone's so ready to argue these days.
It can be intimidating. I get it. But I think it all starts with listening. And I don't mean just waiting for your turn to talk, but actually trying to hear and understand what the other person is saying, even if you don't agree with them.
So it's about empathy.
Yeah.
Like putting yourself in their shoes.
Exactly. Trying to see the world through their eyes.
Which can be really hard sometimes.
It can. And it also takes humility.
Humility.
Yeah. Being willing to admit that you don't know everything, that your own perspective is limited, and hey, maybe you're even wrong.
Wow, that's a tough one.
It is, but it's important.
Okay, I get that.
Yeah.
But let's be real. Not everyone's going to be open to having those kinds of conversations. What do you do when you run into someone who just isn't interested in listening or engaging in good faith?
That's a tough one. Sometimes you just have to walk away.
Yeah.
You know, if the conversation isn't going anywhere productive.
Right.
But even then, I think it's important to be respectful. Remember that even if you completely disagree with someone's views, you're still talking to another human being.
It's like that saying, disagreeing without being disagreeable.
Exactly. And you never know, even if you don't change their mind. You might plant a little seed of doubt.
Make them think twice.
Yeah. Or at least show them that there are other ways of looking at things.
So it's not always about winning the argument.
No, it's about broadening the conversation.
And sometimes those real conversations, those meaningful ones, they happen away from all the noise, you know?
Right away from the public eye.
Yeah, like not on social media.
Exactly. More like those quiet one-on-one chats.
Where you can connect with someone on a personal level.
Yeah, like over coffee or dinner with family.
Those are the times when you can build real relationships and start to understand each other's perspectives.
And those conversations, even though they might seem small, they can actually have a ripple effect.
That's a good point.
They can help break down those barriers of distrust and create a more open and understanding society.
It's like a chain reaction. Well, this deep dive into the South African ambassador controversy has been quite a ride. We started with what seemed like a simple diplomatic spat, But we ended up exploring some really big questions.
Yeah, about power perception, the future of diplomacy.
In a world that's more interconnected and divided than ever.
And what's become clear is that these issues have real-world impacts.
They affect people's lives in tangible ways.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap things up, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What can they do to navigate this complex world and maybe even make a positive difference?
Well, I think it goes back to what we've been talking about. Be curious, be open to different viewpoints, listen with empathy, engage in respectful conversations, and don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions.
And remember, even the smallest actions can make a difference. The way we talk to each other online, the conversations we have at home, how we consume and share information, it all matters.
It really does. We all have a part to play in shaping the narrative, in building bridges of understanding and creating a more just and equitable world.
That's a great note to end on. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking, and we'll see you next time.
In the heart of this nation, under skies so blue, there's a spirit that's stirring values strong and true. From the mountains to the prairies, from the cities to the sea, we stand for liberty, for faith and family. We're diving deep into the heart